Hi everyone, my name is Kevin Lee. I'm the Elihu Rose Scholar in Modern Military History in the History Department. I want to first just thank the History Department, the Jordan Center, and particularly Dr. Elihu Rose for making this event possible. And I'm just going to introduce Franziska briefly. Franziska is a lecturer in history at the Free University of Berlin and was previously research fellow at the Center for History and Economics at Cambridge University. She's a scholar of Russia, Eastern Europe, and Germany, and her broader interests include war and society, myth, memory, and trauma, as well as migration and borderland studies. Her talk today will be based on her new book, Ghosts of War, Nazi Occupation and its Aftermath in Soviet Belarus. So without further ado, please help me welcome Franziska.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be here. It's really, really wonderful to be here. Okay, so let me start with some of the larger questions that motivated me to write this book. So essentially, the book wants to answer three main questions. What is the scope for individual agency in extreme moral circumstances, such as wartime occupation? How do states and societies, social communities, and individuals then confront the legacies of war and occupation? And what do truth, guilt, and justice mean in that process? And how does the process of quote-unquote confronting the past play out within authoritarian states, within dictatorships? So the book examines people's choices and their choiceless choices or impossible choices under Nazi occupation, and the ways in which these then shape post-war Soviet rule. It does so through the lens of Soviet Belarus, a Soviet republic and East European borderland that was particularly affected by the war. Just a couple of words on the historical development of Belarus. So the Soviet Socialist Republic of Belarus was established in 1990 out of the turmoil of war and revolution. As you can hopefully see on this map, so that part where you see number 1, the republic was initially quite small. And then in 1939, Belarus doubled its territory and population size when, following the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Soviet Union annexed Eastern Poland, and then northeastern Poland became Western Belarus. So that's shown here. So these are the parts that the Soviet Union annexed in 1939 and 1940, respectively. So Belarus, which was initially quite small, this is the eastern part, which was Soviet sort of roughly since the Russian Revolution, then more or less doubled its population size and territory size. And with the exception of Białystok region, which was returned to Poland in 1945, the Soviet Union then retained these territories after the war. So that's the Soviet Republic that I look at in the book. And after sort of the Soviets then turned northeastern Poland and into Western Belarus, just 2 years later, Germany broke the pact with Moscow and invaded the Soviet Union. And then all of Belarus came under Nazi occupation from 1941 to 1944. After the Red Army liberated the region from Nazi rule. German occupation brought incredible death and destruction to the Soviet Western regions, and Belarus was among the hardest hit places. About 19 to 22% of the population that by June 1941 lived in the territories that would constitute post-1945 Belarus were killed or died as a result of the war. Now, why did I come to study this topic? Why was I interested in this topic in the first place? Anthropologists usually talk about their positionality, right? And historians don't really do this much, but I wanted to give you a sense of how I came to research this topic. So all of this started a long time ago, when Anne and I were graduate students at Princeton. And I'd maybe I should also say I grew up in Germany, and maybe it's even important to say that I grew up in West Germany. And so within German society, I'm generalizing about millions of people, so that's always a difficult thing to do. But I think there is a quite solid sense and understanding of what happened during the Second World War, of Nazi history, of sort of German crimes, of Auschwitz, of the Holocaust. but there isn't, I think, a very good sense of what the German war of extermination actually meant in Eastern Europe. And what the Holocaust meant in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union in particular. So the impact that Nazi occupation had on large parts of Eastern Europe, including sort of the Soviet Union, I think that's a topic that even to this day, a lot of people might not know a lot about. And they would associate the Holocaust primarily with Auschwitz, but not, for example, with the mass killings that took place in the Soviet Union. So that's sort of kind of the background at which I came to this topic. So I knew as a graduate student, as I was just beginning graduate school in the US, I knew I wanted to study the Nazi occupation of the Soviet Union, but I didn't really know yet which place and what exactly. And I first went to Belarus in 2009. At that time, there was only one outdated tourist guide, and it was, interestingly, it was a Lonely Planet which combined Russia and Belarus, so there wasn't even a separate Lonely Planet on Belarus. And for whatever reason, I didn't buy that. So I was in Kiev previously looking at archives on a pre-dissertation archive trip, and I then took a night train from Kiev to Minsk. And so I got off the night train on a Sunday, and Sundays in European cities are usually very quiet and nothing is open. Plus, this was also before the internet, so before you had access to email on your phone. So essentially, it was pretty much clueless. I didn't quite know where I was, and so then I just started walking around the city, and Minsk was heavily, so Minsk, the capital of Soviet Belarus, was heavily destroyed during the war, and then after the war, rebuilt in a very classical Soviet topography. So the main avenue that goes through the city is called the Independence Avenue today. And again, like it starts with a quite classical Soviet topography that you begin on Independence Square, which used to be Lenin Square, but you still have the Lenin monument to this day. And it then follows on through October Square, and then ends at Victory Square, which commemorates the victory of the Soviet Union over Nazi Germany. But as I was sort of wandering through the city, I soon found myself in a different kind of neighborhood, still very much in the city center. So I was walking along the street and the street called Nemiga, and then saw this kind of throughway, which would take you, as said, into a very different kind of neighborhood, which didn't seem to make a lot of sense in terms of the urban layout and the planning, the post-war planning of the city. And as I was wandering around in this neighborhood, somehow things felt eerie and strange. The street would suddenly end, or as you can see here, some houses really still look dilapidated, partially reconstructed, partially not. There were turn-of-the-century houses and older houses, and then these new kind of Soviet construction style places. And I don't know, I had a sense of it, didn't really know where I was, but it felt like something had happened here. So on this map, just to show you, so this is a map of present-day Minsk, and the yellow line here is that kind of is the Independence Avenue with the Independence, formerly Lenin Square, October Square, and Victory Square. And here is this much older neighborhood, which I then started to cross. So then at night, I finally found an internet cafe. So I was finally able to do a little bit of research. And then I realized that this was actually the place of the former Minsk ghetto, which was one of the largest and the longest operating ghettos in the occupied Soviet territories. And here on this slide, you can see a map of the Minsk ghetto in 1941, around about here, and the approximate location of the Minsk ghetto on a map of present-day Minsk. So very much in the city center. Now that sort of experience really left a very strong impression on me. Maybe had I had a travel guide, beforehand, had I known something about the history of the city beforehand, that would have been different. But in some ways, I feel like my ignorance then really determined the questions that I became interested in. Because I felt like if, this was in 2009, so a long time ago, but still, if the scars of the war and the war was still so present in the cityscape in 2009, what must have happened like in 1944, right after the Germans were driven out by the Red Army? What must have been like in a place that was that heavily destroyed by the war, and that had a ghetto in the city center, what must it have been like to try to reconstruct your lives amid these ruins and amid that kind of destruction? So that's essentially how I then began my research. And I subsequently then, as I was sort of developing my dissertation project, I spent a year in Belarus, and then subsequently, trips later on took me back there. And it was then through living particularly in Belarus that I realized that there are two particular challenges in writing this book. So the first challenge was to account for the complexity of people's wartime choices. The German occupation regime was a regime of death and destruction, but it was also a regime that depended on the limited involvement of some. In the occupied territories, the authorities pursued different strategies towards different population groups. While the Jewish population was singled out for destruction, the Slavic population was treated with a mix of brutality and cooptation. In both regions under military and civilian rule, the German administration depended heavily on the employment of Soviet citizens. And in each district, Soviet citizens were appointed as town and district mayors and as local policemen. As the Germans also kept the organizational structure of the Soviet administration's lower levels intact, many who had worked as, for example, office clerks in the Soviet city administrations then continued to work in the same positions under the Germans. All of this meant that for civilians in occupied territory, it was impossible not to come in contact with the occupation regime. Some people actively joined the German side and took part in atrocities, for example, as local policemen who participated in the murder of the Jewish communities. Others became much more reluctantly, even unwillingly, complicit or entangled in Nazi policies. It was also impossible to stay neutral in the fight between Soviet partisans on the one hand and Germans and local policemen on the other hand. So this is actually a very kind of complex story that only fully sort of disclosed itself as I was in Belarus and talking to historians there, especially also historians through the work of historians like Alias Marinchuk, Irina Romanova, something that I hadn't quite known beforehand, and I'll get back to that later, which still constitutes a big taboo to this day. So it said it was also impossible for the population to stay neutral in the fight between Soviet partisans on the one hand and Germans and local policemen on the other hand. In parts of Western Belarus, this precarious situation for civilians was further complicated by the presence of Polish partisans, so units of the Armia Krajowa, and in southern Belarus towards the end of the war by the presence of Ukrainian nationalists. In consequence, people's decisions and their consequences not only varied over time, many choices were also choiceless choices, adapting a term coined by Lawrence L. Langer, or impossible choices. So for example, when a village head had to decide whether to hand over fellow villagers as forced laborers to the Germans, and then fear punishment at the hands of Soviet partisans, or refuse to do so and fear German punitive actions. The second challenge in writing this book was to account for the ways in which pre-war Soviet rule affected the choices that people subsequently made under the Germans. So again, this is linked to the different interwar histories of Western and Eastern Belarus. By 1941, Eastern Belarus had been Soviet for roughly 2 decades. Western Belarus had belonged to Poland in the interwar years and was only annexed in the fall of 1939. The populations living in these two parts of Belarus had thus experienced Soviet rule in different ways. To Eastern Belarus, Sovietization, which included the violent collectivization of agriculture, had come as a revolution from within, with significant local agency. To Western Belarus, it had come as an express Sovietization from abroad, in the form of Red Army soldiers and cadres from the East. In both cases, Soviet rule came with a significant amount of state violence, with people killed or deported, even more so actually in Eastern Belarus than in Western Belarus. So the comparison then between the Eastern and the Western part of the Republic, and the comparison between Belarus and the other Soviet republics that were under German occupation is then woven sort of into the main narrative of the book. To give you a brief sense of the outline of the book begins at the turn of the 20th century and then extends from the war years into the post-war years. So the first chapter kind of provides the classical historical background and the different ways in which Soviet rule came to Eastern and Western Belarus. The second chapter then looks at wartime choices, and then the bulk of the book focuses on the post-1944 years. After the Red Army reestablished control of the Soviet Western regions, one question shaped encounters between the returning Soviet authorities and those who had lived under Nazi rule, between soldiers and family members, reevacuees and colleagues, Holocaust survivors and their neighbors. What did you do during the war? So in the remainder of the talk, I'd like to speak a little bit about prosecutions, then about how much on personal ways of seeking justice and how that conflicted with the official war narrative. And I would then like to conclude with 3 thoughts on how the book relates to debates outside the field of East European history, and also in particular in light of the fact that the archives, or many archives, many former Soviet archives are at the moment inaccessible to international researchers, what that might mean for future research, what might be potential sort of ways of doing research on this topic in the future without a significant part of the archives. So when the Red Army returned in 1944, the pursuit of truth was a common goal for individuals, communities, and the Soviet authorities alike. Yet they often held different understandings of what that meant. For local party leaders, state security officers, NKVD and the NKGB, and members of the judiciary and procuracy, finding out what people in occupied territory had done was a task of utmost importance, inextricably linked to the reestablishment of Soviet authority. The authorities were determined to punish local participation in German atrocities, and during the first post-occupation years, they prosecuted, for example, many policemen who had taken part in the Holocaust and the killing of other civilians. At the same time, though, the search for alleged traitors was about defining who had and who had not supposedly been loyal to Moscow during the war. As military tribunals translated complex moral gray zones of war and occupation into the language of treason, external pressures or intent were not taken into account. Mitigating circumstances were systematically only recognized if an individual who had first fought on the German side and then later went over to the Soviet partisans. So only in cases in which somebody, for example, had worked as a policeman for the Germans, but then switched side and then later fought with the Soviet partisans and potentially even then later under the Red Army, only in these cases did the military tribunals systematically take that as mitigating circumstances into account. These sort of tensions between, on the one hand, wanting to prosecute individuals who had committed atrocities or had helped the Germans commit atrocities, but also using these trials as a way to defining what loyalty meant. This kind of tension continued to inform later Soviet trials too. Most people who were charged with wartime treason or collaboration were prosecuted until the early 1950s. After Stalin's death in 1953, as part of limited de-Stalinization efforts, the state moderated its punitive policies and in 1955 issued a partial amnesty. In the 1960s, domestic and international changes spurred a second wave of trials, and the prosecution of Soviet citizens accused of wartime collaboration then continued until the late 1980s. So there's a lot more that one could say about trials, and if there's if there are any questions or interest in that, I'd be happy to do so later. There are 3 points, though, that I'd like to raise about these trials, about the Soviet prosecutions, about certain kind of patterns that we can see and trends. For one, contrary to official wartime proclamations, so there's a very famous speech made by Stalin in July 1941 in which he says, traitors only deserve one fate, death. Contrary to that official wartime proclamation, punitive practices were not static, but rather varied over time, alternating throughout the post-war years between more lenient and stricter, less active, and more expansive phases. Punishment is particularly harsh and indiscriminate in 1940, so starting in late 1941, and at a time when it was not uncommon for example, for a cleaning lady who worked for the Germans to receive the same sentence as a local policeman. Beginning in early 1944, then punishment becomes somewhat less strict, with the ratio of death sentences to prison sentences then further dropping in the immediate post-war years. So the second kind of pattern which we can see is that there are different types of trials and shifts in visibility. So while the war was still being fought, the punishment of Soviet citizens in the newly reconquered regions was frequently and deliberately conducted in front of local audiences. So the majority of these trials, and so to say, were public trials. They took place in a locality where a person had, for example, acted as a village elder or a policeman during the war. Many of these public prosecutions were carried out by Red Army military courts as the troops were advancing westward. And I would like to show you an image of one of these trials. I think we have very few images of these early prosecutions. This is the only one that I've came across, which actually shows a kind of a village trial, so to say. This is a trial that took place in the Smolensk region in September 1943, and on trial is the village head Vasile. It's a man. You can see him standing here, and you can see the back. The three backs of the members of the military tribunal here. And he's surrounded by mostly Red Army soldiers, and then probably fellow villagers, and the majority women here. Vasile had, during the German occupation, had served as the head of this village, Usvertim. I think this image, I mean, every image is staged, obviously, but this image nevertheless kind of shows how improvised and quick these Red Army trials were. We know from memoirs that these usually took place within a couple of hours at most. And as said, they took place as the troops were moving westward. And at which time there is still the responsibility of the Red Army military tribunals. But once the Red Army had sort of moved on, the prosecution then became the responsibility of the state security organs. So the NKVD and the NKVD mostly. And that is also the time when we see a switch sort of happening from these early public prosecutions to the majority then being conducted in secret. Meaning that there are no local audiences allowed to attend, but with the exception of a few sort of select trials, which then throughout the post-war years still take place in public, in front of local audiences. And that's sort of another kind of point, although they took place in public and in a specific locality where individuals were said to have committed these crimes, they were usually not publicized outside that particular locality. So they are public, but they're not much publicized. So that meaning for individuals who live in a particular place, it would have been impossible to know whether similar trials were taking place elsewhere. And thirdly, so the third point about these trials I'd like to make is that we do see that there's what you can call a professionalization in the administration of justice happening. So later trial records, especially the ones that we have from the early 1960s on, are far more extensive. So the files that you can get in the archives are far more substantially extensive than the records that we have for the trials that conducted in the immediate aftermath of Nazi occupation. And in contrast to the 1930s, there is, of course, the fact that actual acts have been committed. Whereas in the 1930 trials, at least public trials, which closely resemble in kind of makeup these trials, they're fabricated acts. But the fact that we can see that sort of Soviet military trials become more professional at administering these trials doesn't mean that there's an increase in due process of law. By that I mean that the Soviet collaboration or treason trials continue to lack fundamental standards of rule of law, such as independent judiciary, independent defense attorneys, and the assumption of innocent until proven guilty that form the precondition for any trial to be considered as impartial as possible. In other words, Soviet treason trials did not fulfill the legal criteria necessary to establish beyond doubt an individual's criminal responsibility. In contrast to the authorities who were preoccupied with the question of political loyalty, for many inhabitants of post-war Belarus, confronting people's wartime choices was a highly individualized process, contingent on a multitude of interacting factors, circumstances, and personal experiences. Most cities in Belarus lay in ruins, entire rural districts have been burned down, and large parts of the populations were uprooted or displaced. For private individuals, the moment of return was first and foremost about the much hoped for reunion with family members. Returning home, though, also led to encounters with former neighbors and friends, fellow villagers and colleagues. These encounters not only threw into sharp relief that some, in particular Jews, had lost more than others during the war, they also, and inevitably so, raised questions about people's wartime behavior. Now, one would probably assume that in a dictatorship like Stalin's Soviet Union, individuals would shy away altogether from talking about the war in ways that might deviate from the official lines. That was not the case, though. So in the book, I kind of trace the life of eight different individuals throughout the main narrative. These are 8 individuals that reflect the ethnic and linguistic diversity of Belarus. So they are individuals who either speak Belarusian or Russian or Yiddish or Polish at home or several of these languages, who are Orthodox or Jewish or Catholic by religion. And 4 of these individuals you can see here on the slide with the places that they come from roughly marked in yellow. Again, as an idea to sort of reflect the diversity of the population, but also the diversity of individual experiences. When Vasil Bukov, for example, you can see here in the upper right-hand corner, returned to his village, Bichkis, northeastern Belarus after the war, fellow villagers came over at night and recounted how much they had to suffer during the war. And I'm quoting here, from the Germans, from the partisans, from the Narodniki, who were probably local policemen. Amongst others, also from some people who came from the same villages, in particular from those who up to the war had been Soviet activists and during the war tried hard to serve the Germans. As his recollections indicate, when neighbors and acquaintances met in social settings, they did talk frankly about the war, including sensitive topics such as violence committed by Soviet partisans. But if people spoke about taking furniture from Jewish apartments, stealing food from villagers, or serving in the German organized police forces, they usually always referred to other locals as having done such things, not themselves. And it needed a lot of personal determination and insistence to overcome people's reluctance to respond to uncomfortable questions, and particularly ones that might have brought to light their own entanglement in wrongdoings or crimes. When individuals found out or surmised that members of the pre-war social communities had become complicit or entangled in Nazi crimes, or that their neighbors had taken advantage of other people's plight, they responded in different ways. Some sought comfort in the social relations that had survived, the friendship and solidarities that had not been destroyed by what people had done or not done during the war. Often, people cut all ties with those whom they suspected of wrongdoings, as Olga Bembel-Dierdok did, whom you can see here in the lower right-hand corner. When Olga Bembel-Dierdok discovered that her nephew Igor, who was a former Red Army soldier, who had fallen into captivity, when she discovered that he then subsequently worked as a translator for the Germans, she decided to cut all ties altogether with him. Yet others, like Liebman Moore, whom you can see here, a Holocaust survivor and former Soviet partisan, decided to sever the bonds to their local community altogether, whether this entailed leaving one's hometown or region or Belarus, or if possible, even the Soviet Union itself. Under the conditions of the Polish-Soviet population exchange agreement, Moore was able to leave the Soviet Union and subsequently settled in Palestine. As varied as people's responses to the ghosts of war were, one sentiment was widely shared by inhabitants of Belarus: the urge to seek justice and retribution, that is, punishment that people believed to be morally right. In its most extreme form, retribution meant revenge violence, for example, by beating up a fellow villager accused of having worked for the Germans, which are cases that were reported from villages in both eastern and western Belarus in the fall of 1944. But individuals also pursued many other, less physical means of retribution. Some did so privately, for example, by confronting neighbors directly, demanding the restitution of property that these had acquired during the war. At times, that was successful, at times not. When Bornstein-Belitska, you can see here, when Bornstein-Belitska returned to her hometown after the war, she found, for example, her family house in Grodno intact, but the person who was now living in it would not let her enter. Beyond these private efforts, many individuals found themselves brought into contact with the Soviet state. In their efforts to determine what Soviet citizens had done in the Nazi rule, the authorities relied heavily on local information, on an assortment of names, clues, and stories. Some of that information was supplied unwillingly, such as when torture during interrogations made people provide or fabricate incriminating material about friends or neighbors, or when people were blackmailed into becoming informers. Others agreed to become informers for the state security organs because they saw this as a chance to punish locals they believed guilty of crimes committed in the name of German power. While some consented to pass on information to the state after they were approached by its representatives, many more acted on their own initiative and wrote letters to the central authorities, testifying to the state, whether through the members of the Extraordinary State Commission, the ČKK, or, if possible, as a witness at a public trial, was another means through which individuals could seek retribution. In doing so, some people found that their individual notions of what constituted morally right punishment overlapped with, or even were congruent with those of the regime. When the authorities acted on their tip and arrested a neighbor they believed to have committed crimes in the name of German power, even someone who otherwise was not sympathetic to Soviet power could see the state as a guarantor of justice. The same could also apply to individuals who served as witnesses in court. And I'm sort of stressing the could because, as we know from research in general on the role of witnesses in court and what courts can and cannot deliver, so to say, is a very complicated question, and again, dependent very much on the individual perception of the judgment. So this widespread desire for punishment made it possible for some inhabitants of post-Belarus to find moral justice, sprawiedliwost, within a state whose legal system was and remained profoundly illiberal. The problem was, though, that interaction with the authorities came at its own risk. People who engaged with the state could, of course, only do so on the terms set by the authorities. There were boundaries to what could be said and done, and investigations could backfire on those who initially set them in motion. Nowhere did this become more visible than in many property conflicts. What belonged to who was an immensely contentious question in the immediate post-war years, a deeply personal and at the same time highly political question. The death and displacement of hundreds of thousands of people, and in particular of the region's Jews, and the destruction of houses as a result of military operations or German punitive actions meant that a lot of property, be it apartments, furniture, or clothes, had passed through many different hands during the war. Just how did you manage to move into a new apartment during the war? Because the Germans had burned down your house as punishment for ties to the partisans, or because the partisans had burned down your house as punishment for ties to the Germans, or because a bomb had destroyed your house and you simply needed a new place to stay. Property conflicts were not limited to housing questions, though. How did you come to acquire new furniture and clothes? How did you come to own a cow during the war? Did you take it from the collective farm after the Soviet state took it from you during the collectivization of agriculture in the 1930s? Or did you receive it from the Germans for services rendered to them? And if you bought it from someone, how did that person acquire it? These questions inevitably arose when trying to solve the widespread property conflicts, which is why we can read them as one of the ways in which people in Belarus grappled with the ghosts of war. Sorting them out was an inherently difficult task, both practically as well as morally. And Red Army soldiers, Holocaust survivors, and former partisans often turned to the state, asking the authorities to settle the question of ownership or occupancy rights in their claim. In doing so, they had no choice but to work with Soviet normative categories, with the authorities' notions of right and wrong wartime behavior. This means, of course, in consequence, that it was impossible for someone to seek justice for wartime wrongdoings believed to have been committed in the name of the Soviet state. So the peasant could not complain to Minsk, for example, that Soviet partisans had stolen his cow during the war. Had he done so, he would have made himself suspicious. The partisans were officially deemed unambiguous heroes and defenders of the socialist motherland. In the Soviet narrative of the war as an all-people's war, Belarus occupied a special place as the republic where the so-called all-people's partisan war had taken place. According to this narrative, the local population in both the republic's eastern and western part had, with the exception of a few quote-unquote traitors, stood firmly behind power. And the image on the right sort of shows kind of the meaning of that narrative well. So this is from the main newspaper, Sovetskaya Belarusia, which, and it shows an image celebrating the first anniversary of the liberation of Soviet Belarus on July 3rd, 1945, when Soviet partisans read Red Army soldiers underneath a flag that reads, "Death to the German occupiers for our Soviet motherland." So narrating the years of war and occupation was also about the creation of a new linear story of Soviet Belarusian statehood, one that firmly united Eastern and Western Belarus, formerly Northeastern Poland, under the banner of the Partisan Republic, as the post-war republic came to be known. After Stalin's death in 1953, the general Soviet war narrative and its specific Belarusian version became more inclusive, and within limits, some of its aspects could be contested. Still, because of the centrality of the all-people's partisan war to post-war Soviet Belarusian statehood, there was no space to acknowledge that the relationship between Soviet partisans and civilians in occupied territory had been fragile, unequal, fraught with conflict, and at times antagonistic. The exclusively positive depiction of the partisan-civilian relationship was and remains to this day non-negotiable in Belarus, and for that matter in Russia too. Violence committed by Soviet partisans against civilians is a political taboo. Challenging it comes with high professional and social costs. Privately, some individuals in post-war Belarus tried to make sense of the discrepancy between official and private memory by distinguishing between quote-unquote real partisans who could be honored and quote-unquote bandits. So in oral history interviews, when asked about their experiences with Soviet partisans in both Western and Eastern Belarus, researchers sort of have established a certain kind of pattern whereby respondents would then say, "Oh, he was a real partisan, but that other person was a bandit," even though that quote-unquote bandit was officially a member of the Soviet partisan movement, but he had disqualified himself through actions, sort of, for example, by committing violence against civilians. And so by kind of separating these two and creating these two categories of real partisans versus bandits, I think it became possible for people to sort of honor the deeds of the first group, the real partisans, whereby then externalizing the violence that they experience at the hands of others as the work of bandits, of not real partisans, and thus people who are not part of the Soviet narrative before. But again, even this reframing of the wartime experiences, so the differentiation between real partisans and bandits, could publicly only be articulated at the cost of exclusion from the larger political community. Those who still felt that Soviet power had done them an injustice, either at the hands of partisans or after the war at the hands of Soviet officials, therefore resorted to particular strategies. One way was to write letters to party leaders in which they accused others of being German accomplices. And they hoped that by doing so, they would catch the attention of the state and would be able to mobilize the state on their behalf and have, for example, property returned. Okay, in conclusion, I would like to raise three thoughts where I see sort of this project or book connecting to debates outside the field of East European and Soviet history, and perhaps also ways of potential ways of further research along those lines. So for one, scholarship on transitional justice usually assumes that seeking justice and accountability in the aftermath of war and after Putin contributes to the development of more pluralist democratic spheres. But that's a research field that was largely developed in response for researching the former Yugoslavia and the aftermath of the genocide in Rwanda. In contrast to that, I wanted to know what seeking justice for wartime atrocities meant and looked like in a dictatorship like the Soviet Union. While there was space to do so on the terms set by the authorities, seeking accountability could unintentionally also contribute to the strengthening of state power. So what I mean by that is that when individuals turn to the state, asking them to settle wartime conflicts in their favor, the authorities usually benefited from these letters. On a more abstract level, complaint letters to the regime acknowledged that the Soviet state alone had the means to settle the conflicts brought forward by the authors. I think the importance that this affirmation of Soviet state authority had shouldn't be underestimated, in particular when we consider how rapidly institutions in the Western regions collapsed in the summer of 1941. So you could say that unintentionally, confronting the past, quote unquote, had a regime stabilizing effect, leading not to the creation of more liberal open public spheres, but instead strengthening the mechanisms of power in an authoritarian regime like the Soviet Union. Secondly, I see sort of a connection to what you can call the global moment of post-Second World War justice. So when the war ended, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of individuals were put on trial for their war crime activities in almost all former belligerent countries. This was a global moment, not just because similar types of trials took place in very different political settings throughout all of Europe and Asia, but also because this moment was shaped by the diffusion of new legal ideas and norms that had been created for and developed at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. At the same time, the moment also retained many national features, reflected in the search for alleged traitors that took place in all countries emerging from wartime occupation. So if you look at the Soviet prosecutions of those deemed wartime collaborators, what could that contribute to the research on that moment? For one, we can see that there's always a discursive connection. So the Soviet prosecutions are very much shaped by a set of domestic and international circumstances and considerations. And in these public trials that take place after the war, the government always draws a discursive connection between the collaboration or treason trials and then more internationally oriented trials, in particular, the series of 18 public trials of German and other Axis soldiers that took place in the second half of the 1940s in the Soviet Union, but then also the Soviet Union involvement at Nuremberg. I think also that research on treason or collaboration trials in the post-war Soviet Union can add something to theories of political justice and literature on international criminal law more generally. So, as historians have shown, the Western Allies' war crime trials in both Europe and Asia that were conducted after the war often did not live up to their liberal legal standards. A mix of procedural shortcomings, including looser rules of evidence or denying suspects and defendants the same rights that Western Allied country nationals were granted in domestic courts, usually accounted for that. In Asia, the European colonial empires also often used trials of Japanese military personnel as a means to reassert their authority in colonies that had been under Japanese rule during the war. So again, like we have, I think, a good sense of the laws of trials that were conducted by states that were you could call liberal legal states at home, or that thought sort of understood themselves as rule of law-based legal systems, but then in this particular post-war moment, often conducted trials that sort of did not live up to these liberal legal standards. There's a larger, more theoretical argument behind this, which is largely connected with the name of Judith Schlar, who has argued that even a liberal state's law is never above politics. So Judith Schlar in her work draws a distinction between ordinary criminal justice and political justice. The latter of which, so political justice, which she says, is aimed at the elimination of the political enemy through use of the courtroom. So again, like while there's a debate about the place of politics in liberal law, we don't really have a good sense yet of differences within a liberal justice system. By that I mean that when scholars speak about illiberal justice, they often use the term show trial, which is very much connected to the 1930s trial, particularly the series of Moscow trials, 1936 to 38, of prominent Bolshevik party members, which are sort of seen as the epitome of a show trial, with fabricated acts, fabricated evidence. But what we have here in the post-war settings is trials that, especially the trials of German and Axis soldiers, where while that takes place within an illiberal legal system, the actual acts had, of course, been committed. At the treason collaboration trials, the picture is often a little bit more murky, but the problem here is that you could say we have illiberal justice, but with actual acts, which distinguishes this very much from the 1930s trials. And I think it's sort of a history of these what we call treason or collaboration trials in the post-war Soviet Union, in combination with sort of research on war crime trials in the Soviet Union, or trials of Axis soldiers, can help us get a more sort of nuanced, a rich empirical sense of differences within illiberal justice. And in the end, I think it would be most helpful to think of this as a kind of spectrum, where we then would have to locate between the ideal type sort of liberal trial and then the illiberal justice, where we would then have to locate each trial along that spectrum to be able to compare them. And sort of the last thought, so that's also something that I've been trying to think more about, which is the question of how can the historian study trauma? And by that I mean, how can we not just use the word trauma and infer, obviously, that many of these individuals that we talk about, who suffered through wartime and possibly were probably heavily traumatized, but how can we actually methodologically study historical trauma? Now, research has shown, both clinical and cultural research has shown, that individuals respond very differently to similar traumatic events. And it is sort of that kind of variety in individual responses to similar or the same traumatic events that I think from a historical perspective aren't really easy to grasp. And I think one of the problems here is the source basis. So we have quite a lot of memoirs by Holocaust survivors, which allow for sort of in-depth exploration of the ways in which they later on reflect about the atrocities that they witnessed or that they suffered and that they survived. But there's one big gap in historiography are, for example, the experiences of civilians of these so-called burned villages. So these are villages that the Germans burned to the ground in response to supposed partisan activity in this region. And Belarus is among the hardest hit places. So the Germans respond sort of with indiscriminate violence to any kind of perceived or actual partisan activity, and start, beginning in 1942, start to burn entire districts to the ground and kill the majority of the inhabitants of these villages. And it's very difficult to actually study the experiences of these mostly rural residents because few have left written traces, and and often the sources are quite fragmentary. So we have snippets sort of their experiences in interviews. So one question would be, how can historians try to uncover their experiences and study that? what I've myself found very maybe looking forward again also to thinking about how is research possible with mostly closed archives now, is to look at Honey Kwan's work, for example, who's published, among others, a book called After the Massacre, Commemoration, Consolation and Harmony in Milai, which were two villages. The first one was a village that was burned down by South Korean troops in 1968, and Milai is probably known to everyone, village that was burned down by the US Army in 68 during the Vietnam War, in perhaps not quite similar kind of setting. So both in these cases, as well as in the case of the burned villages in the Soviet Union, these punitive policies and the retaliation against civilians is happening because the army believes that the civilians there are supporting guerrillas or partisans, or accuses them of such. And so what Honey Kwan has done is he looks at ritual mourning practices. So he's an anthropologist who has sort of studied them on a very close micro-historical level, mourning and practices of grief in rural communities. Perhaps that could be a source of inspiration for historical research. There's also Vietnam Nguyen's work, Nothing Ever Dies, on the Vietnam War, but taking a kind of larger comparative perspective on memory on the Vietnam War in the US and Southeast Asia and in Korea. Yeah, so let me end with these thoughts and thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions.
All right, I'll have to, maybe while people are gathering their thoughts, I want to encourage all of our undergraduates to feel welcome to pose a question. It's not often that we get to have a speaker, as I already told Franziska. Some of you will recognize. What will you recognize from my lectures? From her talk? What is it? What did you do? I told you. So let me pass this around. Who didn't sign it? Where should we start? Back here. I suppose if I might start, Franziska. I actually just was hoping, I have a number of questions, but I was wondering if you could walk us through some of the current, or rather, when you said, I wonder if you found an answer to your original question that you said you began with. If this is if I could still feel the scar of this war on the cityscape in 2009, what must this have been like in 1944? How, after having written this book, has your thinking about that original question evolved? What have you come up with? I know that's necessarily broad.
No, I think it's a really important question. I mean, I think as with all research, there are questions that always remain. I think even if they're, if you finish a book, but I think these are larger questions in some ways of. Larger questions of general humanities, so to say. Yeah. Like I do still.
That table is usually solid. I'm so sorry. I thought I could sit there and then manage a little bit more easily. Forgive me.
So this is also an ongoing kind of perhaps a question that we can't really answer in anthropological research. And I'm thinking here of the research by Lina Das and Arthur Kleinman, who sort of pointed out that one thing that continues to be puzzling is that even after the experience of the most traumatic sort of events, of the greatest atrocities, human life continues. So humans continue to live and they continue to try to make sense of their lives and rebuild their, as I said, like their personal lives. Why is that in some ways? I think this is a question that has sort of stayed with me, but it's also so another finding in research on trauma is that when we speak about healing or overcoming these can easily turn into cliches, and that research on trauma really, especially clinical research on trauma, really speaks more about living with the trauma. So there's that the idea that we can overcome trauma is not realistic, but that's about finding ways how to live with that and to live with your grief. And that's something, for example, that I found very much in the 8 individuals that I follow in the book, is that for them, the war never becomes history. And it's also never something that's really, far, like, remote, or feels like it happened many years ago, but it's always feels like it just happened yesterday in some ways. So the war really divides it into pre-war life and a post-war life. Now, what differs here with these individuals too that I look at is that there's one particular person, Zofia Brzozowska, who actually who comes from the family of Polish landed gentry in Western Belarus, and she actually uses more family members to the Soviets between 39 and 41 than to the Germans. So for her, as for the others, like, what the war actually meant in terms of their personal loss different. And also the question of when did the war actually start? Did it start in 39 or did it start in 41? But what they all share is that there is the war, as said, like, never becomes history. And I think coming back to sort of your question, and the question that I initially started my research with is, I think people in some ways try to live with it, and then the urban landscape is being rebuilt and new layers are being added to it. But what we saw reflected in these pictures, I think also in some ways reflects what at least I found through these memoirs in individual lives, that they do continue to be that visible, and then they remain in some ways until maybe generations, pass, and there's no longer a direct link to relatives. So, and I'll end with this thought. I think one important question will be like what happens when that direct link to family members who still experience the war is actually no longer happens. Like, I think it makes a huge difference whether you have grandparents who can tell you stories or not, or you realize that they're silent, but who lived during that time, versus when it becomes, for example, great grandparents, and they, kind of like the way I think of my great grandparents as these people in black and white pictures that are very distant, I know nothing about, essentially. So when that generational link is no longer there to the peasants, and I think that also then influences memory of the war. But I think as long as that generational link exists, it's always there, and it remains there.
If I could maybe follow up on that with one question, I think it might be really interesting if you could tell us a little bit about the actual course of your research, because one of the things that you noted that might not necessarily be obvious to everyone is that you conducted oral histories. And what did that dimension give to your story that might be difficult to access otherwise? And also one of the things, and these are two different questions, but also I think equally significant for us to think through. One of the things you do that's very distinctive that not many historians are comfortable doing is to talk as fluently as you are about research on trauma, for instance, which is to say well, let me just let you lay that out for everyone instead of me doing it, about what that means. You gestured at this in your talk about the difficulty of exploring trauma, in part because one of the things that we know about it is how various it is. That statement in and of itself is somewhat at odds with what we as historians try to do, which is to generalize about cultures and about the ways in which experiences shape entire groups of people as opposed to individuals. We don't want to think that there are highly individualized reactions to particular historical phenomena. And so I'm curious about how you navigate that dimension. And indeed, to an extent, that question sort of redounds back onto the first one about oral histories, because one of the things you're doing is you're getting these individual life stories that you're working with.
Yeah. I mean, maybe to give you a sense of how that research then continued. So after this first pre-dissertation archive trip, I returned to the US, and I, did journal exams and everything else that came with that. And then as I was sort of developing this topic, I eventually then spent a year in Belarus, which back then, so today this is practically impossible with since the protest in 2020 and the crackdown on the opposition. I don't
In
know
Belarus.
in Belarus. I don't know any international researchers anymore who are still going to Belarus, and plus the I don't know if that's still ongoing, but a couple of months ago it was the prosecutor's office has essentially closed down many of the records that I've looked at. So the files pertaining to the Second World War, because they are trying to construct a link between. So the protest movement used the white, red, white flag, and which was also used by some of the people who collaborated or became entangled with the Germans during the war. So in some ways, what the state prosecutor's office in Belarus is now trying to do is kind of to say, people who are protesting against Lukashenko and the government in Belarus today are fascist, as can be seen from this historical World War II files. And so they are going for that material, meaning that even if we had, it was possible to travel to Belarus and to get a visa to work in the archives there, it said like these files for political reasons at the moment were closed. But even before that, it was very difficult to obtain. You need a visa and then you need a residency permit. And for that, you need an institution that would be willing to sponsor you. And because it's an authoritarian state, and because of the sanctions that are being placed in Belarus, there were very few to no institutional context. So what I want to say is like it was difficult getting access, and then it was usually the only international research in the archive. And so when I started to do oral history interviews, I had no network in place that I could draw on. And the entire time I thought, okay, I need a research strategy. I mean, I need to be like a social scientist where I conduct all these interviews according to a certain pattern. But how do I find the people for that? And then what happened is I was living in student dorms, I was meeting people, and I was telling them I was meeting historians, especially those who don't conform to the official narrative and navigate a very kind of fragile, difficult position. And I was telling them about my project. They said, well, in the meantime, why would you maybe like to talk to my grandmother? I could ask her. And I was then thinking, okay, until I have this research strategy in place, this is what I'll do. And it took me a couple of months until I realized that this was my research strategy, so to say, that it was really only through the trust and the kind of that personal connection that I was able to get access in that way. I also realized that it takes a lot of trust to have a stranger come into your house and then tell them these very kind of personal, intimate recollections. And plus, I think for some people, I was the first German citizen that they've met since 1945. So in some ways, like this might seem strange, but in some ways, I never felt like it mattered much because I always felt like they might see me as a person the way I saw them as a person. And I think it also helped that gender in this case played to my advantage. I think often people were expecting somebody more formal and maybe, and then it was just me, with the flowers. Plus I was a graduate student a couple of years younger, standing like in front of the door. And so I think that sort of helped to create a kind of space where one would maybe feel comfortable. But it's actually something that, when we talk about positionality, it's something that I only recently started thinking more about in connection with ongoing debates about decolonization, what does it mean to decolonize sort of our research field. I was actually wondering whether my citizenship might matter, and whether some people might prefer to hear the story from a Belarusian citizen and not from a German citizen. I don't know. I can't really answer that question, but as I said, like I did realize in some cases it was people who hadn't met a German citizen since 1944, and so my sort of second thing was that I really wanted to find I wanted to give voice to people. I was hoping to be able to interview people who otherwise left few written traces. And so we have an imbalance in the source basis, which I alluded to that previously a little bit. We have more memoirs from Holocaust survivors who directly after the war were able to leave the Soviet Union and who then immigrated to Palestine/Israel or the US than we do from the former who remained in the Soviet Union. And they are also influenced by different cultural styles. So again, I'm generalizing, but I often find the ones especially written in the US are at some point, at least those written in the 1990s, become more personal maybe than those who were then written in the 1990s in the former Soviet Union, because they're influenced by what societies talk about and how you would frame things. But especially, and I'll end with that, we have very few sort of written traces by the rural population, especially women. So I was looking for that. I was essentially looking for women who had experienced the occupation in the countryside, and in the hope that that would then complement and or further sort of enrich the picture.
Thank you. Brandon and then Patty.
I'm curious about what brought you back to Belarus for that year after the original visit there.
It's a couple of, I think, factors. For one, and I think it kind of speaks to a question like, I don't know if some of you are thinking of doing a PhD, like why do you choose a particular place in a particular question, right? And in some ways, some of these questions can't really be answered. It's more like a sort of I like these mechanisms was more of a kind of hard thing and not so much of a kind of being able to really think about it in terms of strategies. So it had nothing to really with that. Like for one reason was that one of my friends was from Vitebsk originally and had then immigrated to Israel and then started working in Princeton. So we had a weekly Russian-German language kind of club, and I think through that personal connection in some ways, also because now these are actually very kind of technical things that because of I felt that it would be manageable to cover all of Belarus in one project versus one could have done a similar project on Ukraine, for example. And I felt like that because of the size of the country, simply being larger, it would have been more difficult to do that in terms of sources. So I thought that was kind of the reason why I chose Belarus over Ukraine. And then the Baltics different because first of all, I don't speak Baltic languages, but also because I wanted to get at that question of whether there are differences between the old Soviet parts and the new Soviet parts, the ones that have been Soviet for roughly 2 decades before the war versus ones that were only added early into that. So I think it's sort of a mix of partly kind of hard to explain versus then indeed kind of more technical issues.
I wanted to ask about this, the 1939 Soviet parts and the 1941 Soviet parts, and if you could say more about the differences. I was literally going to ask this, and in particular, both in kind of wartime experience, perhaps, but also the point that you were making about the ways that the post-war trials essentially and the post-war kind of petitioning about the question about what you did during the war and the way that you could maybe voice certain kinds of complaints but not others, and then the effect that had of kind of reinscribing people basically into the Soviet system. And is that mechanism basically kind of helping incorporate the kind of the post-41 territories in a different way than it was functioning in the pre-49 territories? And just could you say more about the different experience?
Yeah. Maybe I can say also in response to your earlier question, so one of the big challenges also just in turning the dissertation into a book and then was really trying to find the right kind of balance between having larger arguments versus then not generalizing about individual experiences. So, and I just found that really difficult. I found it really difficult to make more general statements at the same time insisting sort of on the individuality of or the uniqueness of each kind of experience. And And that question about the differences between the two regions was also a very difficult one to tackle. I think the short answer is it always depends on, there's no general answer to it, but it always depends on the question we look at. So what I mean by that is that when we look at local involvement for whatever reason in the German occupation regime, we can really see that there's no difference between the West and the Eastern part. That's because the Germans have the same kind of pattern everywhere. So everywhere they want local police forces, and they want a town mayor, and they want a village head, and then and so we see that happening, both in the new and the old Soviet territories. And we also see the spectrum of behavior here. So in both West and Eastern Belarus, there's the spectrum of people denouncing their Jewish neighbors, but also people helping or sheltering. So there's this whole range of human behavior. Having said that, obviously one could say, okay, but what about quantitative differences? It could still be that more people in Eastern Belarus helped their Jewish neighbors than in Western Belarus. That's quantitatively extremely difficult to show in the case of Belarus. There's a book by Diana Dumitru, who compares Bessarabia and Transnistria. So she compares an old Soviet part and a part that belonged to Romania before the war with each other, and she actually found significant quantitative differences. I couldn't find that in the case of Belarus, and I think, so I'm not saying that these might not have existed, but if they did, then the contrast wasn't that stark as it was in other places, and where I think it was methodologically easier to detect. But there was one important difference, and that's the summer 1941. So in the summer of 1941, during that transition from Soviet to German rule, there's a wave of pogroms that sweeps through, especially these, or primarily through the areas that were annexed in 1939, 1940 by the Soviet Union. And here we can see clear differences between Western and Eastern Belarus, and that local pogroms, so locals who commit violence against their Jewish neighbors, is happening in Western Belarus, but not in Eastern Belarus. But if we then broaden the lens, we can see that in comparison, the violence is still more intense in Western Ukraine and in the Vladivostok region, and in regions administered by Romania than in Western Belarus. So even here, levels of violence aren't the same throughout these newly annexed territories. Yeah, but to make a sort of a long kind of difficult answer or a long answer to a difficult question, I think again, like, my argument would be that we really have to look at the specific issue that we study to be able to say what differences might be between Eastern and Western Belarus, and that it's impossible to generalize as a whole.
Thank you very much for the talk today. And I was wondering, during your archival research in Belarus, there must be like a wealth of information that cannot be placed into the book due to the extent of the limits of the project. And I was wondering if you can elaborate upon what among the information that was left out, what's a very memorable or interesting part that struck you, personally speaking?
Of information that I simply had to leave out because it wasn't on the immediate topic, or
yeah.
I mean, in general, what was interesting, so I first started archive research in Moscow to get the view of the center. So I started with 3 months there, and I was mostly really confused. And it took a while really to understand that archives obviously are reflections of state institutions, and that was helpful too. So I think it was really helpful to have, or it's necessary to have, both the center perspective and then Republican and then the local perspective, because you also realize, on a side note in this research, how reports that are written from the local level to, for example, Minsk, then differ sometimes from reports that Minsk then writes to Moscow. So sometimes more complicated or uncomfortable information is left out in these reports. And so that in itself was sort of an interesting thing to see. But essentially, because the problem is that you can technically order copies of files. There's no, I wasn't allowed just take pictures in the archives. But copies can be really expensive. Plus, you never know whether if you order the copies in both the Russian and the Belarusian archives, if you actually will end up getting those. Because it might be that the archivists then determine that they contain personal information. So let's say you order pages 1 to 10, and then it happens that they say you only get pages 1 to 9, and page 10 contains personal information. So what it means essentially that I was just sitting there for like 1.5 years and typing out these files. It was also interesting because they had this one day when I left the archives and I thought, wow, all I did today was like essentially type out what was contained in one file. And if somebody would tell me, like, if I'd ask somebody else, so what did you do today? And say, I copied one file. I would think, God, that's like a terrible, sad life, you know? But it wasn't, because, you know, you have these larger questions that you want to pursue and put together. But there's a lot of information that didn't make it into the book. Because in the beginning, as I was trying to piece everything together, everything seemed interesting, right? And I think one of the hard parts later on is letting that go. And to realize that just because it's interesting and it was super important to get a sense of the context, it doesn't help answering a particular question. I think that's part of this painful part of revision, when you understand that. So when I don't know if you had the same experience. When I defended my dissertation, I was in this, you know, great mood. I was like, wonderful, I have this dissertation. And then one of my dissertation advisors said, well, just think of it as a very good first draft, you know. It was a little bit like, I was like, but what? I have a manuscript, isn't this a book? And then I realized, no, it's not a book, you know. It needs revision, and further archive research and thinking about it. And as part of that, it's like letting go. So a lot of information, for example, that's not in there is about the population exchange between Poland and the Soviet Union after 44, simply because it didn't, or just in general, the moment of return, that's a very compressed chapter in the book. Was much more information, but it simply wasn't leading to answering that question. So I have to leave it out. And I don't know what I'll do with that.
Yeah, let's check it. I don't want to keep poor Franziska on her feet for too long. I think we have a couple more minutes.
So I was thinking, there was the part about the trial where you showed the picture and the thing that you were saying that public and then already publicized, it was kind of together. That's just sort of wild to me, because in the one hand is that you have it, I mean, especially right, this, what did you do during the war? It is a kind of top-down question in a certain way, but then it's also extremely localized, based on a really localized experience of what war was. And sorry, I'm getting to a question, I promise, but just sort of that it's sort of like, what do you think the significance of this isolation is, right? Because of course, yeah, the war is this big thing, but it's actually very individualized and very localized. And then the fact that this trial is happening in such a way that you don't know if over, you know, over there they're having one as well. But then at the same time, you make this argument about, that I referred to already, about kind of like being, you're claiming on the goodness of the state, essentially, to kind of decide what justice could be in a certain way if you had certain wrongs done to you. But like, how does that work together? Basically, how does it be so fragmented and centralizing at the same time?
Yeah. So I think these are essentially in many ways educated guesses, as I couldn't find documents that would sort of attest to, you know, where for example the central state security organs would explain why these trials are so localized. So I've looked for not just in Belarus, but I've also sort of looked in the case in Ukraine, just to see whether that pattern was different in different parts, but I couldn't find any information on these public trials, which we know were taking place, you know, in Ukraine as well, for example, or in, as you saw, in Western Russia and in Belarus, in beyond really a small local newspaper. I think but there's a couple of answers are more plausible than others. I think it's also the shift that we see with punishment sort of becoming somewhat less strict and early in 44 has a lot to do with the fact that yes, the Soviet government wants a sort of punishment of retribution, but they also come as liberators. But Soviet power is still quite brittle, and especially, I mean, Soviet power in the countryside, for example, in eastern Belarus, is quite unpopular. So people are generally overjoyed to see the Red Army return. They're overjoyed to see German occupation come to an end. But there's much more apprehension about the return of Soviet power and communism, especially the return of collective farms. And I mean, the Great Terror, collectivization, all of that was taking place just a couple of years before the Germans came. So I think, and that memory of that is very much present. So I think if had the Soviet authorities really essentially sentenced every village head and every town mayor and every policeman in each locality to death, then the number of people killed would have been higher than during the Great Terror in the late 1930s. And that does square well with the image of the liberator. And so I think there's a deliberate sort of calculation behind keeping these trials localized, that you don't, as a local, you don't have a sense of the kind of overall pattern and full scale of Soviet retribution which is happening. And also because it contradicts the official image of the war as an all people's war, where only very few people, like the traitors, are supposed to have sort of been not supportive of the war effort, but everybody else did. But once you actually say, oh, but each town had a town mayor, and each town had a policeman, and then each village had a village head, and then we have translators, and we have people who work in the city administration. And what about, do we even now start to talk about teachers and what they're like? Then you get a very different image of what German occupation meant like. And I think that's something that they didn't want to make that public, which is why these trials remain really only for the local audiences, but without revealing that larger pattern.
Hey, thank you so much, Francis.
Thank you.